Welcome to the deep dive, where we take deep dives into fascinating topics.
That's right.
Today, we're tackling something that might sound a bit upside down.
Yeah.
Ethical egoism.
Interesting.
Buckle up, because we're about to explore a theory that claims acting in your own self-interest is actually the most moral thing you can do.
Wow.
Pretty wild.
Right. It certainly challenges the usual be kind, help others approach, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're diving into an excerpt today that lays out the foundation of this theory.
It does. I mean, usually being good means putting others first,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So how does ethical egoism square that circle?
Well, it's all about where the emphasis lies.
Okay.
Ethical egoism doesn't necessarily condone running around being intentionally cruel to others,
Okay.
but it does suggest that any action, even something seemingly selfless, should ultimately benefit you.
Okay.
Your desires, your well-being,
Right.
those are the compass pointing towards moral action.
Okay, that's a really different framework. So it's not about ignoring others' needs entirely,
No, not entirely.
but seeing your own well-being as the ultimate goal.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's important to distinguish ethical egoism from the idea of psychological egoism.
Right.
Psychological egoism claims that people simply are selfish. It's how we're wired.
Okay.
Ethical egoism goes a step further, arguing that people should be selfish,
Ah.
that it's the most ethical way to live.
So it's not just an observation about human nature, it's a moral prescription.
Precisely.
Got it.
Now, a very famous example of this line of thinking is Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism.
Oh, yeah.
Her novels, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, really champion this idea of rational self-interest as the foundation for a moral society.
Right. I've heard of those, but I haven't actually read them.
You should check them out.
Rand's argument, if I'm remembering correctly,
Yeah.
is that traditional altruism, putting others' needs above your own, can actually be detrimental.
That's right.
It can lead to self-sacrifice and ultimately hold society back.
You got it. For Rand, focusing on your own well-being and pursuing your own rational self-interest leads to a more fulfilling life for you and a better functioning society overall.
Okay, I have to admit, even though it sounds counterintuitive,
Yeah.
there's a certain logic to that.
Right.
It makes you think about the motivations behind good actions and whether focusing on yourself can actually have positive ripple effects.
Absolutely. One of the biggest appeals of ethical egoism is this idea of practical rationality.
Okay.
You know yourself best, right? So who better to decide what you need and how to pursue it?
I see the appeal, but isn't there a danger of that becoming a justification for, well, just being plain selfish?
Sure.
If everyone's focused on what's best for them, wouldn't that create a pretty chaotic and potentially cutthroat world?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one that critics of ethical egoism bring up all the time.
Right.
Does this framework open the door to a world where everyone's just out for themselves,
Yeah.
potentially at the expense of others?
Okay, so let's dive into those criticisms.
Sure.
If the appeal is this idea of self-knowledge and rational choice,
Right.
what are the arguments against it? What are the potential downsides?
Well, as you hinted at,
Mm-hmm.
a major concern is that it seems to promote unchecked selfishness.
Okay.
Critics worry that ethical egoism basically gives people a free pass to exploit others if it serves their own interests.
I can see how that would be a problem.
Yeah.
If everyone's operating on that principle,
Right.
it seems like it would be tough to build a functioning society,
Right.
let alone one based on things like cooperation and fairness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that leads into another major criticism.
Okay.
Ethical egoism seems to neglect the importance of empathy and cooperation.
Mm.
Think about it. Most societies are built on the idea that people can understand and care about each other's needs,
Right.
that we can work together for a common good.
Yeah, it's kind of baked into the idea of community, isn't it?
Yeah.
If everyone's laser focused on their own goals, who's going to step up to help someone who's struggling or volunteer their time to make things better for everyone?
Precisely.
Right.
And that lack of empathy and cooperation
Mhm.
could really erode the trust and shared purpose that communities need to thrive.
So it's not just about individuals being selfish, it's about the potential damage to the social fabric as a whole.
Right.
Okay.
And that brings us to another tricky issue.
Okay.
What happens when two people's self-interests collide?
Right.
Ethical egoism doesn't really offer a clear way to resolve those kinds of moral conflicts fairly.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I mean, what if my self-interest is getting a promotion, but my coworker's self-interest is getting me fired so they can have that promotion?
Right.
It seems like a recipe for constant competition.
Yeah.
maybe even hostility.
It definitely raises those questions.
Yeah.
And our source text highlights some real-world scenarios where this focus on self-interest above all else could have some pretty negative consequences.
Yeah, I remember mentioned examples of businesses polluting the environment to save money,
Yeah.
or individuals lying or cheating to get ahead.
Exactly.
Right.
Actions like those might benefit the individual in the short term, but they can cause significant harm to society as a whole.
And what about people who are vulnerable or marginalized folks who might not be in a position to effectively pursue their own self-interest? I'm thinking about the elderly, people with disabilities, those facing systemic barriers.
That's a really important point, and it's a major ethical challenge for ethical egoism.
Right.
The source specifically points out that if everyone is solely focused on their own needs, those who are already vulnerable could be left behind without adequate support.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It feels like focusing solely on yourself, even with the best intentions, could lead to a kind of moral isolation. Do you lose sight of the bigger picture, the interconnectedness of things, if you're constantly prioritizing your own needs?
That's a really insightful observation.
Yeah.
And it's something critics often point out. The idea is that ignoring the well-being of others can ultimately backfire because we
Right.
do live in an interconnected world.
Right.
What impacts one person often has ripple effects on others.
Okay, so we've unpacked a lot of the criticism,
May have.
but I'm guessing there's another side to this coin, right?
There is.
If ethical egoism has garnered so much attention,
Yeah.
there must be some compelling arguments in its favor.
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
It's not like everyone who supports ethical egoism is advocating for a dog-eat-dog world.
Right.
They see it more as promoting personal responsibility and independence, not just rampant selfishness.
Okay, I'm definitely curious to hear more about that.
All right.
What are some of the arguments they make in defense of this theory?
Well, one defense is the idea that pursuing your own self-interest can actually lead to outcomes that benefit others,
Okay.
even if that wasn't the primary intention.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure.
Okay.
Think of a successful entrepreneur. Their drive to build a business might create jobs, provide valuable products or services,
Right.
and even contribute to economic growth.
Mm,
All of those things benefit other people, even though the entrepreneur's primary motivation was likely their own success.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
It's like that saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. But wouldn't you say that the benefit to others in those cases is more of a byproduct?
Right.
The main goal is still self-interest, right?
That's true.
Okay.
And that's where another defense comes in,
Okay.
the argument for moral consistency.
Okay.
Supporters of ethical egoism argue that it's actually more honest reflection of human nature.
Uh-huh.
They say that deep down, we all prioritize our own well-being.
Right.
So a moral system based on that reality is more likely to be effective.
So instead of denying our inherent self-interest,
Right.
they're saying we should embrace it and build a moral system around it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Another argument in favor of ethical egoism is that it encourages independence. It discourages people from becoming overly reliant on others, which some see as a positive thing.
I'm starting to see how there are different ways to look at this, and it's definitely more nuanced than I initially thought.
Right.
But how does all of this theory play out in real life? Can we see ethical egoism in action, even if it's not explicitly stated?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Take, for example, a business owner who chooses to invest in expanding their company rather than donating to charity.
Mm-hmm.
Are they acting out of ethical egoism, prioritizing their own success?
Right.
Or are there other factors at play?
Yeah.
It's not always clear-cut.
And the source brought up that thought-provoking doctor scenario, right? The one where a doctor operating under ethical egoism might prioritize wealthier patients over those in greater need simply because it's more profitable.
Yes. That scenario really forces us to confront the potential consequences of prioritizing self-interest above all else.
Yeah.
And it highlights the complexities of applying this theory in the real world.
It's fascinating how even just talking about ethical egoism raises so many questions.
It really does.
Not just about morality, but about the kind of society we want to live in.
Yeah, and I think even if someone completely disagrees with ethical egoism as a moral framework,
Right.
wrestling with it still forces you to examine your own values and motivations.
For sure. It makes you question those assumptions we often have about goodness and selflessness.
Right.
How much should we prioritize our own needs and desires? Is there a way to balance those with a sense of responsibility to others? Can we create a system where pursuing your own goals doesn't have to come at the expense of others?
Those are the big questions, aren't they?
Yeah.
And ethical egoism, whether you find it compelling or repulsive, shines a light on that tension between self-interest and our obligations to others.
Right.
And honestly, there are no easy answers.
You know, what strikes me is that ethical egoism might sound appealing on the surface,
I agree.
but when you start digging deeper, you see how it could lead to some pretty significant problems if it was put into practice on a larger scale.
I agree. We've talked about the concerns around fairness, cooperation, even the potential for exploitation.
Right.
And ethical egoism doesn't seem to offer clear solutions when those inevitable conflicts arise between individual self-interest and the well-being of others.
So where does that leave us? We've explored this concept from multiple angles,
We have.
but I'm not sure what the takeaway is supposed to be. Is it all just an interesting thought experiment with no real-world implications?
I think the most important takeaway is that ethical egoism forces us to confront some fundamental questions about what it means to be human and how we should navigate our lives in relation to others.
Yeah.
It pushes us to think critically about what motivates us,
Yeah.
what our responsibilities are,
Mm-hmm.
and what kind of world we're creating through our individual choices and actions.
I like that. It's not about arriving at a simple right or wrong answer,
No.
but engaging in this ongoing exploration of ethics and how we want to live.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that exploration doesn't end when this deep dive is over.
Yeah.
You can continue to wrestle with these questions.
Huh?
Think about the arguments we discussed, both for and against ethical egoism.
Right.
Consider those real-world examples we talked about.
Yeah.
And ask yourself, is there a middle ground? Is there a way to pursue your own goals and live a fulfilling life while also contributing to a society that's just and equitable?
That's a great point. That's something all of us have to grapple with, whether we subscribe to ethical egoism or not.
Absolutely. This conversation is just a starting point.
Yeah.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep searching for those nuanced perspectives that help us better understand ourselves and the world around us.
Well said. And on that note, a huge thank you to our expert for taking us on this deep dive into ethical egoism.
It was my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, we hope this has sparked some new ideas and encouraged you to continue exploring these fascinating, complex questions.